Welcome everyone to today's Welcome Change conversation, where we hear from social entrepreneurs about what works, what's next, and why they remain hopeful. Good afternoon. So some context before we dive into this conversation with Amelia. Each year, 650,000 children spend time in foster care, and approximately half of them are placed with strangers. Once within the foster care system, these children are moved from family to family on average once or twice every year. I'm Manmeet Mehta with the Ashoka team, and today we are privileged to be joined by Ashoka fellow Amelia Franck Myers. She's founded an organization called Alia Innovations, which takes an evidence-based approach to reimagine public child welfare agencies. Amelia believes that redesigning these agencies as primarily prevention agencies will positively impact challenges from incarceration to homelessness to healthcare and more. And in her view, healing childhood trauma is the key first step in transforming our world. So welcome, Amelia, and thanks again for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
Some quick housekeeping notes as we get started. The chat remains open for your comments and questions. There's a Q&A box. Please feel free as the conversation goes on to drop in comments and questions there. We'll talk about 20-25 minutes and try and get to all of your questions before we wrap. So now with only 30 minutes in our conversation today, let's dive in. Amelia, let's get to the central idea of your work, this notion of belonging as key to a nurturing childhood. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. Over the years, it's become more clear in the research, although I think it's been clear for centuries in Indigenous wisdom that children need to have an uninterrupted sense of belonging. So this is a sense of where they came from, who their people are, what they're made of. And this has to be in a way of no matter what, right? So we have, I think, in modern times in child welfare and in our collective consciousness thought that as long as children were safe with someone, it was good enough, even if that someone changed. So they moved from this home to this home to this home, as long as they were under the care of an adult, it would be good enough. And it's really become apparent in the research, and as I said, known for much, much longer in Indigenous wisdom, that isn't good enough, that your larger family community, it's really important to be connected and have a sense of belonging there so that you know that someone has your back no matter what, your safety no matter what, and that it does matter who is caring for the child. It's not just anyone will do.
And is this perspective unique, Amelia? How does it differ from the view across the sector?
I don't know that it's totally unique, but it's very different from how our systems were set up. And I think this is an evolving kind of way of thinking. Our systems were really set up on the idea that, as long as a child was with a family, it didn't matter which family, it didn't have to be their family. And even if we moved kids, that would be okay as long as they were with a family. And so, what we're learning now is the lifelong predictive harm of separation from one's family and the additional harm that comes in those transitions between caregivers, and that humans really rely on this sense of connection and belonging for a sense of safety. It's how we experience safety as humans, is knowing that if we are too sick or too tired or too young or unable to care for ourselves, there is a reliable, consistent network of support that is there for us. And it matters that it is people with whom we are related.
Yeah, and we're talking about the system here. So just taking a step back, how does the foster care system work? How do children wind up there and how do they move through it? Yeah.
I mean, children end up in foster care for any number of reasons, but upwards of 80% come in not for abuse or sexual abuse, as I think the large part of society believes. Large number of children come in for reasons of neglect, and that is most often around issues of parental substance use, poverty, where kids are left alone because parents are working, that kind of thing, and other forms of neglect, including sometimes also for issues of racism, that we disproportionately separate Black, Brown, and Indigenous children at much higher rates than white children. And a lot of that has to do with the societal conditions kind of surrounding communities, and that's a sign of other kinds of disproportionate outcomes.
And talk to us a little bit more about the cultural drivers that have shaped the system.
Yes, so we have some really strong kind of cultural beliefs in the US around people who are unable to keep children safe or people who harm children. So we have a cultural need to punish those people. There is not really a sense of what happened to you. It's really what's wrong with you, and you deserve to be punished for that. So we are often separating children and punishing parents and keeping their children away from them as a way to punish the parents, when in fact it's really punishing the children very substantially. And so just thinking about that cultural need to punish, the idea that children can be redistributed and be fine, right? So they can be adopted out or farmed out to other families, and they do just as well, those kinds of cultural ideas. And then really the sense of kind of personal accountability and responsibility, regardless of your circumstances. And so no matter what happened to you growing up, you're expected to be able to overcome that on your own and to safely parent your own children. And once a person turns 18, we're really all out of empathy for them. So maybe they also had traumatic childhoods and then had children and were unable to safely parent them, but we're no longer concerned about what happened to them or helping them with the drivers of their substance use or other challenges. Now you have to be punished because you're above 18, and we go in to rescue and remove children at that point.
Mm-hmm. So keeping that in mind, and the trauma moving around and the lack of uncertainty and all of this being predictive of a range of future problems, but it's not just, that's not where it stops, right? So for example, young women in foster care are more than twice as likely as their peers to get pregnant before the age of 19, while facing greater likelihoods of the same challenges around homelessness and incarceration and PTSD, addiction, all of which then sets them up and their offspring to repeat this cycle.
Mm-hmm.
When you imagine, what is your vision that you're working on, have been working on for a foster care system that addresses all of these dimensions of trauma and impermanence and move towards belonging?
Yeah, I mean, what you just said is really at the core of it, is that the system is set up to perpetuate these cycles because we don't offer support or empathy to parents at all. So we're really rescuing, removing, and treating children while parents are blame, shame, punished, and disconnected. And so they may have many more children as we are treating and separating the children that they've had. And so this idea of how do we not only ensure that children are safe, but that parents have what they need to safely parent, right? Without just rescuing and removing and treating the children and then letting the cycle perpetuate and continue. And so, we're really interested in a world in which children are kept safely with, not from, their families. And that means a very different perspective around providing family support in order to help them to safely stay connected to their children. And that's a very different thing. All of our funding systems and our laws right now are set up around rescue and removal of children, and all the resources go to the child and kick in once the child is separated. Family First is new legislation with some new flexibility and funding that gets us started in the right direction, but we have nowhere near the resources or policy or legal infrastructure necessary to be able to support parents in order to safely parent. So that is a different way of kind of looking at this, is thinking about what do kids really need? What do they really need is for their parents to be okay. Right? They don't really need a substitute family. And frankly, there just aren't enough of them anyway. They don't really need our treatments, our therapies, our evidence-based practices. They need their families to be okay and to be able to keep them safe. And we invest very little in ensuring that can happen, and billions of dollars in creating a parallel system in which we focus on the treatment of children for the normal, natural responses to what happened to them instead of avoiding that condition.
And so what you're sort of starting to illustrate here is sort of a reimagining or a new understanding of the problem, but also building on a nurturing ecosystem, if I can use that phrase to encapsulate all of the things you mentioned, around children so that they can grow up and thrive, which is a monumental task. And so when you break it down into how you move towards it, what are some of the 2 or 3 opportunities that you're seeing as ripe for reform and change in the next sort of 6, 12, 18 months?
Well, first, I just want to say, it's a monumental task, but we're already doing it in creating a separate artificial system. We are already supporting parents, their foster parents, though, not birth parents. We are already pouring billions of dollars into a system to treat the consequences of our actions rather than pouring it into the prevention of those symptoms, right? So it's really a shift in where does our support go, both financially and in terms of our concept around what children need to thrive. So there's that. I think the opportunities are in shifting some of these resources to be able to support families and communities earlier, and having those supports come from communities rather than governmental systems, to divesting these resources back to communities so that when a parent is struggling, there is a place to call for help. Because right now, if you call child welfare agency in your local community and say, I can't take it anymore, or I'm drinking too much, or I feel like I'm addicted to meth, they'll be right over, right? And so you risk losing what is most precious to you when you call out for help. And we have to have a different kind of a system if we expect families to be able to get help earlier, or the help that they need to be able to keep kids safe, and not let it get to the escalated point of children are already harmed. The harm has already happened. And then we perpetuate and further that harm through separation.
So in doing this work, though, the other interesting thing is that you are working within the system, so to speak. So how are you working? Can you sort of talk a little bit more about your work with county officials and state officials in advancing this mindset and the practices that go with it?
Yes. So we work with innovators and early adapters in public systems by and large, sometimes private, but largely public. And so those are people who already know things need to change and are ready to change, but don't have the resources or capacity to drive that change, and we partner alongside them. But we also partner with folks with lived expertise, with parents who have been engaged in the system, with youth who have been engaged in the system. And we really believe that the solution comes in nurturing that middle ground. So it's not strictly working with systems alone, because they have tried their best over decades and decades, but have done that outside of the expertise of people who are closest to the problem and the challenge, and have created more challenges, not less, in doing that work in that way. And it's not strictly community organizing, because these systems hold the legal authority, the funding, the resources, and the power to separate families. And so really working together side by side with folks with lived expertise alongside systems leaders to co-design, to nurture that center ground of co-design of how do we bring together, shift mindsets and systems, shift resources and systems, shift ways of practice to stop the current harm, which is actively happening as we're speaking, and work alongside parents and youth with lived expertise to design new ways of work. And in doing so, engaging community partners and divesting resources to community partners and services so that families have access in culturally specific ways in their community without risking separation when they call for help.
Yeah, and what's also powerful here is this co-creation, but the roles that you're creating for the people within systems and for young people and their parents that have this lived experience to not be passive recipients or the deliverers of policy, whatever the role might be, but to actively participate as change makers, which is a shift in power and how they see themselves, and their ability to create change and to be active and influence not only their lives but the lives of other children and others in this position.
That's right. And a really important component of this is preparing systems leaders to be more trusted partners, because what has happened over and over is that families and communities and youth have been invited in, and it's like, you know, there's a survey, there's a focus group, thank you for your opinion, and then we're going to go back and do still what we think should be done, right? We still hold the power in the system. There isn't a real power sharing that occurs, and part of that is because leaders need to do their own work in how do I become a more trusted partner? What is the empathy building in this experience? What is my own anti-racism work that has to be done to understand the historical context of how we got here and about the harm that is perpetuated in doing the work in the ways it has been done? And so we've developed a resource alongside parents and youth during the pandemic called Dear Leaders, which is it's just a resource, a tool to help leaders to do their own examination and reflection work to become more trusted partners, because trust is very thin between communities and these systems who have, you know, repeatedly caused harm disproportionately in communities of color. And so that work is really important to do before jumping in. You know, we get called all the time, what are the right survey questions, or what should the focus group do? And we say, no, the work is yours to do about why you might not want to survey families, right? So to do our own self-reflection and change work first.
And that's powerful as well. And we have so many other questions coming in, so I'll move on. But just I want to underscore how trust and is in building and rebuilding and reweaving that trust in community and between community and the systems that are designed to serve them is key before we can move forward. We're going to pivot, keeping an eye on time, to some of the newer sort of implications arising from recent abortion bans in half of the states across the country.
Yes.
More unwanted pregnancies, probably, including expectations that many of them can be in very difficult situations, from genetic complications that can create lifelong strain of care. Many of these affected states have already overwhelmed foster care systems. And what are you anticipating? What is the strain on the system right now, and what do you anticipate as the effect of this decision sort of cascades over the next few months and years?
I think the implications and complications and results of this decision just cannot be overstated. The child welfare system is already crushing under the current weight of the demand there. And you said some states, right? It is every state and every system is struggling, as is the rest of the nation, with having a workforce that is capable of doing this work. Many systems are down up to 50% and more of their workforce. I'm aware of some counties that have 0 child welfare workers. The work is being done by folks in economic support because they can't hire people to do the work. States have engaged over the last few years on a deinstitutionalization reform. So many residential and institutional facilities have been closed and are no longer operating or have pivoted their work. We do not have enough resource families to care for kids, or foster families to care for kids. We have kids sleeping in child welfare offices all over this country, child welfare staff staying overnight with children who are really challenged and can be quite dangerous, alone in offices and, eating fast food for every meal because that's all that's available. That is already happening. That was happening before this decision. And so the idea, you know, as we sit with 650,000 children in foster care, many of whom are living in inappropriate settings because of the lack of resources, both placements and people to keep them safe. The idea that this system that is currently crushing under the weight of the current demands would be able to handle an additional influx that would be created is ludicrous. That is spoken by people who do not understand the current challenges of the system. And so what I might predict going forward is that we take a backlash swing to going to more institutional, more congregate, more group care, because we do not have the capacity to manage this, which means a reinstitutionalization of kids, something we've been working on for decades to move away from, because we know the detrimental lifelong harm that does for children. Not to mention, as you mentioned, the potential of really medically fragile kids who are even more challenging to care for, and who we do not have resources for in our healthcare system, nor in our child welfare system currently. And then, you know, just the whole idea of the chemical messages and what it does to a person to have a lifelong beginning chemical message that that you are unwanted, and the predictive lifelong trauma and consequences from that happening as well. So there are lots of predictive kinds of ways that our system is going to be stretched, challenged, and will have kind of critical failures as a result of what is happening.
I mean, I know it's still early days and trying to map out sort of what one does in response to that. But related, Sharon's asking a question, which kind of goes to the heart of the matter here, around how do you, you're reframing the problem. You're imagining a solution that is quite runs opposite to how the system is currently designed. So how do you bring folks to the table? Like, what are the incentives and what is the conversation? And Sharon specifically asks, how do you dismantle the money-making system around the way it's currently designed that refuses to change, because this is a billion-dollar industry? And so when you think about that, what has your experience been in creating?
Yeah. $29 billion industry. And so there are a lot of forces at play to keep things as they are, right? That is absolutely true. There's a lot of money involved, there's a lot of power involved, and there is a lot of kind of core assumptions upon which we built this system that are at play, like Black, Brown, and Indigenous children would fare better with whiter families, or poorer children fare better with wealthier families. There's this cultural component, there's a power component, there's a money component, all at place to keep it as it is. What we do is we work with innovators and early adapters. So like in any system, things are on kind of a normal curve, right? There's a set of people who really see this differently, who are motivated and ready to do the change. And our approach is to work with those folks, that we're not talking people into this change. It is well documented why it needs to happen and what the consequences of not doing it are. And we are focused on building proof of concepts with people who want to do the change, that we can do it. So for example, in the Alia Innovation cohort that just wrapped up after 3 years, we worked with 14 counties in 4 different states, and demonstrated that without new laws, really without new money to these systems, no new big positions or changes, we were able to reduce the overall average of the number of kids separated by their from their families by about 30% in 2 years, reduce the number of kids in care by about 30% in 2 years, and reduce the number of kids living in institutional or residential care by about 40% in those 2 years. And so it can happen in the existing system when we shift the mindset about what children need, what families need. And so we're really interested in building that proof of concept for people who say it can't be done, or there's too much inertia. It's like, well, but we already did. And so really showcasing ways to do this work with mindset shift and with then co-design with folks with lived expertise and that shift of power, we have within the current system the capacity to make very significant change.
And building on this new, just recently wrapped up proof of concept, what is your level of optimism considering the other conversations that you have ongoing with county and state officials?
Yeah.
What is your level of optimism, and what are you anticipating? Where do you go from here?
Yeah, I lean towards very optimistic. I think that you know, some of the shifts we have seen is 5 years ago, I would be called on a regular basis to make the case for change, right? So to convince people that the child welfare system needed transformation. And we built all of this evidence. We did a research brief on the case against family separation. We did a social return on investment study on the true cost of foster care, which when we do it well is a loss of $3.64 for every dollar we invest. And when we do it the way we typically do it is a loss of $9.55 for every dollar we invest on a $29.9 billion industry. So we built all this research and this social return on investment study to convince people, yes, it has to change. I never get called to do that anymore. That is not what people want. The calls that we get are, we know it needs to change. How do we do it? Where do we start? And so to me, that's an incredibly optimistic sign that I'm no longer spending my days, and my team is no longer engaged in trying to convince people to change or that change is needed. We are now moved to the how. Okay, we get it. So now what? And that to me creates an enormous sense of optimism, because if people are willing, if they understand the change needs to happen, then we can work on the proof of concept. Then we can try different ways. Then we can start demonstrating the ways that this change can happen. And that is a much more optimistic place to be than convincing people that the 650,000 children living outside their family every year in this country need to be with their families. Like that is exhausting to explain to people why siblings should not be separated, why not anyone would do, why moving a child 10 times in 1 year might create emotional harm or damage that has a lifelong predictive pattern. That part is hard to do, but we are through that part. We are to the part now where people want to make a change, want to do it differently, and know it needs to happen.
That's incredible to know. That is a huge barrier to get past. Congratulations to everybody who's been working, you know, your peers, you in this field to make that happen. Wow. We're almost at time. We have a couple minutes. Amelia, you've been generous enough to stay a few minutes more, and we have a few questions. So we will we'll keep going a few minutes past the half-hour mark. But Amelia, before we go, there are questions still coming in from our listeners, but I want to pivot to you for a minute. You've been doing this work for more than 30 years. This is hard work. What keeps you going? What energizes you?
You know, just to build on my last point. So those folks who are ready to go, who are, you know, early adopters and innovators who are trying to make this change, they are incredibly motivating to me, incredibly inspiring to me. The level of bravery that needs to happen in order to make this change is stunning, because although folks are convinced there needs to be change, there's also a very large contingent that you referred to earlier who have things to lose from making this change and don't want the change to happen, right? So it's not that they don't believe it needs to, it's they have too much to lose in doing so. And so I really take my inspiration, and I really take my you know, resilience and joy from being associated with brave leaders who risk their reputation, their livelihood, who go through the really hard work of doing their own internal scrutiny around undoing messages that they have learned, not only about what kids need to thrive, but about race and racism, about the role of families and folks with lived expertise. You know, that is incredibly challenging work to do. And folks who stay at that every single day and work to keep more families safely together, that is wildly inspiring to me.
And to us. So thank you also for sharing their stories, because there's often a silence there. We're going to just quickly run through some of these questions. It's an interesting one. An entirely new kind of parenting education that reaches everyone, everywhere, could be a powerful kind of primary prevention. Should public health organizations be developing this new kind of parenting education?
I am personally not a big proponent of parenting education, and the research is not clear that that is what needs to happen. Although I appreciate the idea of it, right? It is most often not that folks don't know how to parent, but that they are unable to parent because of their own childhood trauma, because of their own substance use, numbing the pain of that trauma, because of their own conditions as a result of poverty or oppression. And so I am really a proponent of attending to those needs that I think we often approach parents with parental education when they want their children, they want to parent their children. And there may be things that, I'm not saying that all parenting education is unnecessary. There may be things to advance that, but there's underneath work that has to happen before I can even hear you about how to parent, because I have my own survival needs as a parent around the abuse and trauma I experience that I'm acting out or living out unconsciously with my kids. So there's so much healing work that needs to happen before we get to that kind of thinking part of the brain with what are the mechanics or how-tos of parenting. And so I would be much more invested in universal supports for healing and supports for families that don't involve education of parenting as a place to begin.
It's interesting. There are, I think you've kind of answered this question a little bit about the cultural shift, right? Who needs to get on board for the cultural shift around investing in biological families versus foster families? Is there anything that, Amelia, that you want to sort of underscore or add to comments you've already shared?
I mean, sometimes kids can't live safely with their parents. That's true. And we cannot do enough work fast enough to make it safely possible. But the first option doesn't need to be folks who are unrelated. And we just do not have the internal infrastructure or capacity to do the kinds of exhausted search and support necessary with families, right? It's just kind of like, where can I put this kid? And so the resources, not only to the parents, but to the larger family system to avoid separation, are incredibly important there. And in the meantime, we sometimes, at this point, given the current function of the system, sometimes do need foster and resource families to care for children because of our kind of lack of resources to be able to support families to do different kinds of works with them in an earlier and more preventive way. So the system is in transition, right? The system is going from what we refer to as the old way to the new way. And we are right smack dab in the middle of a system that is disintegrating before our eyes and needs to intentionally be put into hospice. But the really urgent need is, what do we do instead? It is building those new ways of work. I think there's a collective agreement in society that the foster care system is not a shining example of our public systems, right? So I think people understand that. Where the real opportunity is how do we do this differently, right? What do we do instead to keep children and families safely together?
And it's been inspiring to hear you articulate just very clearly what that reimagined system can look like, and the strides that you've made in shaping that. Amelia, is there anything, or just keeping an eye on time, that you'd like to add here and talk about that we haven't yet highlighted or brought up in conversation so far?
Well, I mean, there are a few things that are on the horizon that I'd like people to kind of keep their eye out for. We are actually publishing within the next month a social return on investment study that also looks at kinship and really shows how keeping children within their extended family is not only important thing to do from a trauma perspective, from the research perspective, but also from the financial perspective for the system. The social returns on that are pretty substantial. And so that'll be released in about the next month. We're also launching very soon something called Bright Spots, which is a digital home for innovation in this area. So how do we do it differently? Who's doing it differently? Where can I look for examples of that? There'll be a digital home that has been vetted through families and will be have an element of folks with lived expertise deciding what is the kind of right approach to include there. So there's some more resources there. You know, Dear Leaders is also free for download, can be individually or collectively done. That's a really important piece. And the only other thing I would really highlight is that I am a deep believer, because I have seen this, that we know how right now to get 70 to 80% of those 650,000 children home with their family. We know how to do that through relational trauma healing and exhaustive family search, and we're not doing it. And so these kids do not have to be living in offices and hotels. That doesn't have to be happening. And our system does not have to be strained to the capacity it is. We know how to do that, and that can be done. And I really also think, you know, if folks are not doing this work with those core pillars of lived expertise and anti-racism, that we're missing the mark. Those are the two pillars of transformation. And so I just hope and encourage everybody who's interested in this to be centering voices of color and centering voices of folks with lived expertise as we continue to work to shift the system and build those new ways of work.
Thank you. I can't think of a better way, a better frame, and a better point to wrap us up at. We are over time, and thank you so much, Amelia, for agreeing to stay over. I know you've got a packed calendar today. So we hope you've all enjoyed listening, and thank you for sharing comments and asking questions. You'll see a lot of links to the research pieces that Amelia has mentioned in the chat, as well as ways to follow Amelia and Alia Innovations work online. So yeah, please stay in touch with us and her team. We're happy to forward on any questions you might have that we haven't addressed. Our Welcome Change conversation continues next week, so stay tuned for that. Ashoka remains privileged to find and support fellows like Amelia who are doing this really, really important work. Yeah, we'd like to wrap us up with just saying thank you. Thank you for sharing your insights and your optimism for the future, which is built on sort of very substantial effort that has, you know, a reflection of the hard work of change makers that you work with across the spectrum there. So yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of great friends and colleagues and some Ashoka fellows as we all push our own pieces of the system forward. And so I'm so grateful to all of them as well, and to you folks at Ashoka for supporting and highlighting this important issue and work we're doing alongside our colleagues to make this change.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again, everyone. And yeah, the conversation continues next week. So look forward to staying in touch. And thanks again, Amelia.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.